They called him Joe Bananas, but that nickname barely scratches the surface. Before the FBI knew his voice, before Senate microphones caught the tremor of fear in America's institutions, before the word Godfather became a myth larger than life, there was a quiet, calculating man who believed, truly believed, that power was not taken with noise but inherited through blood, patience, and silence. Joe Bonanno did not rise through chaos. He rose through destiny. And that belief would make him one of the most enigmatic, controversial, and self-mythologizing figures in the history of organized crime. Joe Bonanno's story is not simply the tale of a mafia boss. It is the story of a man who tried to turn crime into aristocracy, violence into governance, and himself into history. He would become the youngest boss of a major American crime family, survive wars that wiped out entire generations, disappear under circumstances that still divide historians, and, most audacious of all, break the most sacred rule of the mafia by telling his own story. But what he revealed may be only half the truth. The rest lies buried in contradictions, missing years, whispered betrayals, and a legacy that refuses to settle into certainty. Born Giuseppe Charles Bonanno on January 18, 1905, in Castellammarese del Golfo, Sicily, Joe entered a world where power was ancient, personal, and merciless. Castellammarese was not just a town. It was a breeding ground for a specific mafia tradition, one rooted in rigid hierarchy, blood loyalty, and old-world codes that predated American gangland chaos. His family was already entangled in this universe. Multiple relatives were connected to mafia clans, and from an early age, Joe absorbed a worldview in which authority was not questioned, loyalty was sacred, and revenge could wait decades if necessary. When Benito Mussolini launched his brutal crackdown on the Sicilian mafia in the 1920s, many mafiosi faced a choice: prison, death, or exile. The Bonanno family chose exile. Joe fled to the United States in 1924, entering a New York already simmering with criminal opportunity. Prohibition was looming, and America was about to become the richest criminal marketplace in modern history. Unlike many future mob bosses who rose from the streets, Bonanno arrived with something rarer: lineage. He aligned himself with the Castellammarese faction in New York, led by Salvatore Maranzano, another Sicilian who believed the mafia should be structured like a Roman Empire. Their enemy was Joe, the boss, Masseria, whose power rested on brute force, street soldiers, and chaos. What followed was the Castellammarese War, a bloody, shadowy conflict that reshaped organized crime forever. Bonanno was still in his mid-20s during this war, but do not mistake youth for insignificance. He was already trusted as a courier, strategist, and intermediary. While others pulled triggers, Bonanno listened, remembered, and planned. He understood something crucial. In the mafia, survivors write the rules. In 1931, the war ended, not with a truce, but with assassinations. First, Masseria was killed, lured to a restaurant, and executed by men loyal to Lucky Luciano. Then, in a twist that shocked the underworld, Salvatore Maranzano was murdered only months later. Luciano, seeing Maranzano as a would-be dictator, ordered his death and dismantled the old Sicilian hierarchy. But Joe Bonanno survived. At just 26 years old, he was named boss of what would later be known as the Bonanno crime family. He was the youngest boss in the country. This was not an accident. It was a compromise. Bonanno was acceptable to the Sicilians, non-threatening to Luciano, and young enough to be shaped, or so they thought. What they underestimated was Joe Bonanno's patience. Unlike flashier bosses, Bonanno ruled quietly. He avoided unnecessary violence. He preferred alliances through marriage. Literally, he married into powerful mafia families, strengthening ties not only in New York, but across the United States. Under his leadership, the Bonanno family expanded into narcotics, garment industry rackets, trucking, and international smuggling routes that stretched from Sicily to Canada. Here lies one of the great contradictions of Joe Bonanno. Publicly, he later claimed to oppose drug trafficking, portraying himself as a moral traditionalist. Privately, evidence suggests his family was deeply involved in heroin smuggling, particularly through the infamous French Connection pipeline. Whether Bonanno personally approved every operation is still debated, but the profits flowed, and his power grew. Bonanno believed in something almost unheard of among American mobsters: legitimacy. He envisioned the mafia not as a gang, but as a governing body, Cosa Nostra as a parallel state. He admired order, hierarchy, and discipline. He despised what he saw as the Americanization of the mafia: reckless violence, media attention, and greed without honor. This ideological divide would eventually lead to one of the most dramatic internal conflicts in mafia history. By the early 1960s, Bonanno felt threatened. Other bosses, particularly Carlo Gambino and Tommy Lucchese, had become immensely powerful. Bonanno believed they were undermining traditional Sicilian leadership and plotting against him. What he did next was either the boldest move of his life or the beginning of his downfall. He allegedly planned to eliminate his rivals. The so-called Banana War, or Bonanno War, erupted when Joe Bonanno attempted to remove Gambino and Lucchese from the equation. The plan failed spectacularly. Allies hesitated. Information leaked. Trust evaporated. In a world built on silence, Bonanno had overplayed his hand. Then, in 1964, Joe Bonanno disappeared. For nearly 2 years, his fate was unknown. Some believed he was dead. Others claimed he had been kidnapped by rival families. Bonanno himself would later say he was abducted, held against his will, and eventually released. Skeptics argue this was a strategic disappearance, an attempt to reset the board, avoid assassination, or manipulate perceptions. The truth remains elusive. When Bonanno resurfaced, weakened and isolated, the Mafia Commission stripped him of power. His own family was taken over by rivals. The man who once ruled through bloodlines and patience was now an outsider in the empire he helped build. But Joe Bonanno was not finished. In a move that shattered mafia tradition, he cooperated with authorities, not as an informant in the classic sense, but as a narrator. In 1983, he published A Man of Honor, an autobiography that sent shockwaves through the underworld. For the first time, a major mafia boss spoke openly about Cosa Nostra, its rules, its philosophy, and its history. To some, Bonanno was a traitor. To others, he was a historian preserving a dying culture. The book is elegant, reflective, and carefully selective. Bonanno portrays himself as a principled man navigating a corrupt world, often minimizing his own brutality while emphasizing betrayal by others. This is where the mystery deepens. Was a man of honor a confession or a final act of control? Many facts align with known history. Others contradict FBI files, witness testimony, and even logic. Bonanno omits certain murders, reframes conflicts, and casts himself as a reluctant participant in violence. The book reveals, but it also conceals, and perhaps that was the point. Joe Bonanno lived to the age of 97, dying in 2002, peacefully, far from the gunfire that claimed so many of his contemporaries. He outlived almost everyone who once sat beside him at the table of power. In the end, the man who believed in legacy achieved it, not just through crime, but through narrative. Yet questions remain unanswered. Was his disappearance real or staged? How deep was his involvement in narcotics? Did he truly believe in honor? Or was it simply a more elegant mask for control? And most importantly, did Joe Bonanno break omerta, or did he redefine it by choosing what the world would remember? In the mafia, survival is victory, memory is power. And Joe Bonanno mastered both. He did not die in a hail of bullets. He did not vanish into obscurity. He became a voice, a carefully measured one, that still echoes through the dark corridors of organized crime history. And maybe that was his greatest crime of all. And yet, even after the publication of A Man of Honor, even after decades of analysis by journalists, prosecutors, historians, and former mobsters, Joe Bonanno remains frustratingly out of reach, because the more he spoke, the more it became clear that silence had simply changed form. To understand the depth of Bonanno's mystery, one must look not only at what he did, but at what he avoided. Unlike other bosses who reveled in fear, Bonanno cultivated distance. He rarely appeared in public scandals. He avoided flashy lifestyles. He did not seek celebrity, and he despised the idea of gangsters becoming folk heroes. In his worldview, visibility was weakness. A boss should be felt, not seen. This philosophy allowed him to survive where others did not. During the infamous Appalachian meeting in 1957, when dozens of mafia leaders were exposed by police in upstate New York, Bonanno was conspicuously absent. Some claim it was coincidence. Others believe he had advance warning and chose not to attend. If true, it suggests an intelligence network so refined that Bonanno could sense danger before it materialized. There are persistent rumors, never fully proven, that Bonanno maintained indirect channels with political figures and foreign intermediaries far beyond what was publicly acknowledged. Sicily, Canada, New York, Arizona, his influence moved quietly across borders. While other families fought over territory, Bonanno focused on infrastructure, supply lines, marriages, generational continuity. He was building something meant to outlive him. That vision, however, clashed violently with the reality of post-war America. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, could no longer ignore organized crime. Senate hearings exposed the mafia to the public. Wiretaps, informants, and new laws made the old Sicilian codes increasingly obsolete. Bonanno recognized this shift earlier than most, but he miscalculated how much power he had left to resist it. His attempted purge of rival bosses was not just about control. It was ideological. Bonanno saw Gambino and others as pragmatists willing to dilute tradition for profit. To Bonanno, that was heresy. The mafia was not a business. It was a lineage, a sacred order, and those who forgot that, in his mind, were already dead. Ironically, it was this rigidity that isolated him. After his fall, Bonanno retreated into a strange half-life, neither fully free nor fully imprisoned. He faced legal troubles, contempt charges, and constant surveillance. Yet he was never truly destroyed. No assassination attempt succeeded. No prison sentence erased him. It was as if removing him from power was enough. Killing him would only turn him into a martyr. When he finally chose to write his book, it was an act layered with calculation. Bonanno understood something fundamental about modern power. Narrative outlasts force. By telling his version of events, he seized control of history itself. Prosecutors could argue facts, rivals could whisper accusations. But Bonanno had given the world a coherent story, told calmly, convincingly, and without visible fear. And that is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Joe Bonanno. He never appeared haunted. Unlike other mob figures who expressed paranoia, regret, or visible decay, Bonanno aged with composure. In interviews, he spoke softly, almost philosophically. He framed violence as necessity, betrayal as tragedy, and himself as a man caught between eras. Whether this was genuine reflection or the final refinement of self-mythology is impossible to know. Even his critics admit one thing: Joe Bonanno was not reckless. Every move he made, every alliance, every silence, every word was deliberate. Which brings us back to the question that still lingers like a shadow. What did Joe Bonanno take with him to the grave? There are names he never mentioned, deals never documented, deaths attributed to, unknown assailants, years of his life accounted for only by vague explanations. The mafia is built on secrets, but Bonanno elevated secrecy into an art form. He revealed just enough to appear transparent, while keeping the core untouched. Perhaps that is why his story continues to fascinate. Joe Bonanno was not the most violent gangster, he was not the richest, he was not the loudest, but he may have been the most disciplined. And discipline in a world of chaos is a form of dominance. In the end, Joe Bonanno achieved what few ever do. He controlled his rise, survived his fall, and authored his own legacy. Whether that legacy is truth or illusion remains for history to decide. But one thing is certain. In a life defined by power, silence, and shadows, Joe Bonanno did not simply live through the mafia's golden age. He shaped how it would be remembered. And perhaps, long after the last gunshot faded, that was the victory he wanted all along. Yet even that sense of closure is deceptive. Because Joe Bonanno's story does not truly end with his death, it fractures. It splinters into conflicting interpretations, unfinished threads, and unanswered questions that refuse to settle. The deeper you go, the clearer it becomes. Bonanno didn't just live in history. He engineered ambiguity as a final shield. Consider his relationship with the other 4 families after his downfall. Officially, he was pushed aside, neutralized, rendered irrelevant. Unofficially, things were never so clean. There are indications that, even in exile, Bonanno maintained indirect influence through loyalists, relatives, and old debts that were never fully erased. In the mafia, removal from office does not necessarily mean loss of respect. And respect, once earned, can be quietly lethal. Some former associates claimed that Bonanno was still consulted on disputes well into the late 1960s. His opinions carried through intermediaries. Others insist this is myth-making by men desperate to attach themselves to a legend. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Bonanno may not have ruled, but he was not forgotten. And in that world, being remembered is a form of power. His move to Arizona in later years is often portrayed as retreat, but it can also be read as strategy. Arizona at the time was a crossroads, far from New York's scrutiny, yet close enough to major trafficking routes and growing criminal networks. Bonanno framed the relocation as retirement. Critics argue it was repositioning. Once again, motive dissolves into interpretation. One of the most controversial aspects of Bonanno's later life is the question of cooperation. He never became a classic informant. He did not wire up friends or testify in open court against fellow bosses. But he did talk. Extensively. To authors, to academics, to select officials. He answered some questions freely, others obliquely, and some not at all. This created a dangerous gray zone. To hardliners, any speech was betrayal. To pragmatists, Bonanno had simply adapted to a world where silence no longer guaranteed survival. He justified himself by arguing that omerta was meant to protect the innocent and the organization, not to preserve lies forever. Whether this was philosophical evolution or convenient rationalization remains fiercely debated. What cannot be debated is the impact. After a man of honor, the mafia could no longer claim to be unknowable. The book humanized mobsters without absolving them, intellectualized violence without celebrating it, and, perhaps most damaging, made the inner logic of Cosa Nostra accessible. Future prosecutors, writers, and filmmakers drew heavily from the worldview Bonanno presented, even when they rejected his self-portrayal. In a strange twist, Bonanno helped immortalize the very culture he claimed was dying. And then there is the matter of fear, or the lack of it. Many who met Bonanno late in life remarked on his calm, not arrogance, not bravado, calm. He spoke like a man who believed his fate was already settled. Some interpreted this as spiritual acceptance. Others saw it as supreme confidence that nothing more could be taken from him. After all, what punishment remains for a man who has lost power, survived betrayal, and lived long enough to tell his own version of events? Perhaps the most unsettling theory surrounding Joe Bonanno is this, that his greatest achievement was not avoiding death, but redefining victory. In a criminal world obsessed with dominance, Bonanno pivoted toward endurance. He lost the throne but kept his voice. He surrendered territory but claimed memory. Most mob bosses are remembered through indictments, wiretaps, and the words of their enemies. Bonanno ensured he would be remembered through his own. And yet, there are gaps. Entire decades compressed into a few pages, encounters hinted at but never detailed, decisions explained without context. It is in these gaps that speculation thrives. Some believe Bonanno shielded living figures. Others argue he protected family. A darker interpretation suggests he was still bound by selective loyalty, that even in old age, some rules remained unbreakable. If so, then a man of honor was not a confession. It was a negotiation, a final bargain between silence and survival. Joe Bonanno once wrote that a man's true measure is not how he gains power, but how he relinquishes it. On the surface, this reads as wisdom. Beneath it, there is something colder, acceptance that power is temporary, but influence, if properly preserved, can be eternal. In the end, Joe Bonanno was neither hero nor simple villain. He was a transitional figure, straddling the ancient Sicilian mafia and the modern American criminal machine. He understood both and trusted neither completely. That is why his story still unsettles, because unlike many who lived violently and died young, Bonanno had time. Time to reflect, time to refine, time to choose what the world would know and what it never would. And somewhere between truth and performance, Joe Bonanno disappeared one last time. Not into hiding, but into legend. But legends, by their nature, are unstable things. They invite admiration, suspicion, and endless reinterpretation. And Joe Bonanno's legend is particularly volatile because it rests on a paradox. A man who built his life on secrecy ultimately trusted words more than silence. To truly grasp this paradox, one must understand how deeply Bonanno believed he was different from the men around him. He did not see himself as a gangster in the crude American sense. In his mind, he was a custodian of an ancient system, one that predated the United States, predated capitalism, even predated the idea of organized crime as law enforcement defined it. He saw Cosa Nostra as a social order born in response to oppression, not a criminal invention. This belief shaped every decision he made, including the ones that destroyed him. Bonanno never adapted emotionally to the new mafia. After World War II, power shifted. Violence became more transactional. Loyalty became temporary. Profit eclipsed tradition. Bosses like Carlo Gambino mastered this new reality. Bonanno resisted it. He believed adaptation was corruption. In a rapidly evolving underworld, that belief was fatal. Not immediately, but inevitably. And yet, even in defeat, Bonanno refused to become small. While other fallen bosses faded into obscurity or paranoia, Bonanno retained a sense of purpose. He studied philosophy. He wrote. He spoke about honor, family, and destiny. This was not the behavior of a man broken by loss. It was the behavior of a man reframing it. Critics argue that Bonanno's later years were an exercise in self-deception, a way to rewrite failure as moral superiority. Supporters argue the opposite, that he saw the end coming and chose dignity over desperation. Once again, the truth slips between perspectives. There is also the question of fear. Not fear of death, but fear of insignificance. Joe Bonanno watched an entire generation of mobsters become caricatures. Arrested on camera, recorded on wiretaps, reduced to courtroom exhibits. He despised this. To him, it was not justice, it was humiliation. By telling his own story, he believed he was rescuing meaning from disgrace, but meaning is dangerous. Because once you explain violence, you risk justifying it. Once you intellectualize crime, you risk normalizing it. This is why Bonanno remains controversial, not just as a criminal, but as a narrator. His calm tone, his measured language, his refusal to indulge in cruelty, all of it makes his world feel disturbingly reasonable. That discomfort is part of his power. Joe Bonanno forces us to confront an unsettling idea, that evil does not always roar. Sometimes it speaks softly, patiently, and with impeccable logic. Sometimes it believes it is right. Perhaps that is why his story still resonates in an age far removed from prohibition and mafia wars. Because Joe Bonanno was not a relic of chaos. He was an architect of order, an order built on loyalty, fear, and selective memory. And selective memory was his final weapon. Even now, historians argue over where to place him. Was he a relic clinging to a dying code, or a visionary who understood narrative before anyone else? Was he a failed dictator or a disciplined survivor? Did he betray the mafia Or did the mafia betray him first? There is no definitive answer. Only perspectives. Only fragments. Which may be exactly how Joe Bonanno wanted it. Because in a life defined by control, the ultimate act is not domination. It is ambiguity. To leave behind a story that cannot be closed. A character that cannot be fully condemned or absolved. Joe Bonanno did not ask to be forgiven. He did not ask to be admired. He asked to be understood on his terms. And in that request lies his final mystery. Because understanding Joe Bonanno means accepting that some men do not seek immortality through monuments or bloodshed, but through narrative. Through the quiet confidence that if you tell your story first, and well enough, you shape the battlefield forever. The guns fall silent. The witnesses disappear. The files gather dust. But the story remains. And as long as it does, Joe Bonanno is not entirely gone. And maybe that is the most unsettling legacy of all. That Joe Bonanno understood, long before most of his peers, that the future would not belong to the strongest, but to the ones who could explain themselves. In the final years of his life, Bonanno watched the mafia shrink. Indictments decimated families. Informants multiplied. The aura of invincibility collapsed under fluorescent courtroom lights. The very idea of Cosa Nostra as an untouchable force dissolved into transcripts, plea deals, and prison sentences measured in decades. For many old-world bosses, this was unbearable. For Bonanno, it was confirmation. He had always believed the old mafia was already dead. What survived, in his eyes, was something else entirely. An imitation without soul, a structure without philosophy, and that belief allowed him to detach. Where others raged against the modern world, Bonanno analyzed it. He spoke about inevitability, about cycles, about how power, once exposed, is already in decline. This is why some researchers argue that Bonanno was not broken by his removal from power, but relieved by it. The throne had become a trap. Running a crime family in the age of wiretaps and informants required paranoia, constant violence, and a willingness to sacrifice everyone around you. Bonanno had built his identity on continuity and bloodlines. The new rules demanded disposability. In that sense, his fall may have spared him from becoming the very thing he despised. Still, this interpretation does not erase the damage he caused. Under Bonanno's leadership, lives were ruined quietly. Careers ended suddenly. People disappeared without headlines. Violence did not vanish just because it was discreet. It was simply administered with restraint, which often makes it easier to rationalize and harder to mourn. This is another layer of the Bonanno enigma, the absence of spectacle. His crimes do not scream. They whisper, and whispers are easier to ignore. Even today, descendants of that era, families, neighborhoods, entire communities, carry consequences that cannot be traced to a single trigger pull or court case. Bonanno's style of power left fewer fingerprints, but deeper impressions. And yet, when asked late in life if he regretted his choices, Bonanno did not answer the question directly. He spoke instead about fate, about being born into a world already shaped, about choices made within limits set long before conscious thought. Some see this as evasion, others as brutal honesty, because what if Joe Bonanno was right about one thing? That not all lives are freely chosen, and not all exits are clean. That idea does not absolve him, but it complicates judgment. Joe Bonanno forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that systems endure longer than individuals, and that morality inside those systems is often internal, self-justifying, and dangerously coherent. He did not see himself as evil. He saw himself as consistent. And consistency, when applied without empathy, can be devastating. As the years passed and his name faded from headlines, Bonanno became something rare, a criminal elder statesman. He was studied, quoted, debated. His words entered universities, documentaries, and popular culture, not as instructions, but as artifacts of a vanished order. The irony is sharp. The man who tried to preserve tradition ended up embalming it. Today, when people speak of Joe Bonanno, they rarely speak of fear. They speak of intelligence, discipline, strategy, longevity. And that, perhaps, is the final victory he engineered. He shifted the emotional response. He replaced terror with intrigue. But intrigue is not innocence. Behind every elegant sentence he wrote lies a reality he chose not to dwell on. Every moral framework he described required enforcement. Every code of honor demanded punishment. The silence he mastered protected not just dignity, but cruelty. And still he survived, outlived enemies, outlasted institutions, outwrote rivals. Joe Bonanno died not as a fugitive, not as a prisoner, but as a man whose name had already crossed the threshold into history, not frozen, not settled, but open to interpretation. Which brings us to the final question. Was Joe Bonanno a man who lost everything except his story? Or a man who sacrificed everything else to ensure the story survived? In a world where power is temporary and truth is negotiable, that distinction may be the only one that matters. And somewhere, in the space between fact and narrative, between silence and confession, Joe Bonanno still waits, calm, composed, and unresolved, just as he planned. And if Joe Bonanno is still waiting, it is because his story never offered a clean ending, only a controlled fade. That, too, was intentional. Most criminal empires collapse in noise, gunfire, indictments, public disgrace. Bonanno engineered something else entirely. He exited slowly, almost ceremonially, allowing time to blur responsibility and soften judgment. By the time the public truly paid attention to his words, the blood was already decades old, the victims anonymized by history, the emotions dulled by distance. Memory had done its work. This is why Joe Bonanno remains so dangerous as a historical figure, not because of what he did, but because of how convincingly he explained it. He spoke of honor in a way that felt ancient, almost noble. He spoke of loyalty as if it were a moral absolute, not a tool of control. He spoke of violence as if it were regrettable but necessary, an unfortunate tax paid to preserve order. In doing so, he reframed organized crime not as chaos, but as governance, and governance, once framed correctly, always finds sympathizers. This is the quiet power of Bonanno's legacy. It tempts the listener to lean in, to understand, to empathize, to separate the man from the consequences of his actions. Few mobsters ever achieved that level of narrative seduction. Even Lucky Luciano, architect of modern American organized crime, is remembered more for his ruthlessness than his philosophy. Carlo Gambino is remembered for power and silence. Joe Bonanno is remembered for ideas. That alone sets him apart. But ideas have consequences. Bonanno's insistence on tradition over adaptation helped fracture his own family. His refusal to fully embrace the modern criminal economy isolated him. His belief in bloodline legitimacy clashed with a world where profit determined rank. In many ways, his downfall was not caused by betrayal, but by obsolescence. And that may be the cruelest irony. Joe Bonanno believed deeply in continuity. Yet the system he loved could not survive unchanged. By the time he recognized this fully, it was too late to reclaim power, but just in time to reshape memory. That timing was not accidental. Bonanno waited until the mafia could no longer punish him effectively, until his peers were dead, imprisoned, or weakened, until his voice could no longer shift the balance of power, but could still influence interpretation. Only then did he speak openly. This is not courage, it is strategy. And strategy was always Joe Bonanno's true language. Even his moments of apparent vulnerability, his kidnapping story, his claims of betrayal, his reflections on loss are delivered with restraint. He never begs for sympathy. He never pleads innocence. He positions himself as a man acted upon by history, rather than an author of it. Yet every step of his life contradicts that posture. From his early rise to power, to his alliances, to his failed coup, to his carefully curated autobiography, Joe Bonanno was always acting, choosing, shaping outcomes. He was not a leaf in the current. He was navigating it. which leads to a final, uncomfortable realization. Perhaps Joe Bonanno's greatest talent was not leadership or patience or discipline. Perhaps it was self-awareness. He understood the limits of force. He understood the fragility of secrecy. He understood that in the long run, violence erases itself, but stories accumulate. And so he invested in the only asset that appreciates after death: narrative control. This does not redeem him, but it explains him. Joe Bonanno did not want to be feared forever. Fear is unstable. He wanted to be debated, analyzed, quoted. He wanted his name to survive not as a cautionary tale, but as a case study. And that wish was granted. Today, Joe Bonanno exists in a liminal space between criminal and philosopher, between tyrant and chronicler. He is neither fully condemned nor quietly forgiven. He is discussed, revisited, reinterpreted, exactly where he is hardest to destroy. Because as long as people argue about who Joe Bonanno really was, he remains active in the cultural bloodstream. Alive not in body, but in discourse. Not in power, but in influence. And maybe that is the final truth behind the myth. Joe Bonanno did not escape justice. He outlasted it. He did not defeat his enemies. He waited for them to disappear. He did not win the war. He rewrote what the war meant. In the end, the man who lived by silence mastered something even more enduring: the last word. And he made sure it sounded calm. And calm, in the world Joe Bonanno inhabited, was never accidental. It was a signal, a posture, a declaration that panic belonged to lesser men. What makes Bonanno's story so enduring is that it resists moral closure. There is no single moment where justice triumphs, no cinematic reckoning that balances the scales. Instead, there is longevity. There is adaptation. There is a man who understood that time itself could be weaponized. Bonanno did not run from history. He waited for it to slow down. While prosecutors chased younger, louder figures, Bonanno aged into irrelevance, or so it seemed. In reality, he was aging into safety. Every year that passed reduced the urgency of his crimes, blurred witness memories, and thinned the ranks of those who might retaliate. By the time his voice became public, the infrastructure capable of silencing him had already decayed. This was not luck. This was foresight. Joe Bonanno belonged to a generation that understood cycles: rise, consolidation, decay. He saw the arc of organized crime, not as an endless expansion, but as a phenomenon bound to collide with modern surveillance, media exposure, and institutional power. Many bosses denied this. Bonanno accepted it and planned accordingly. That acceptance is why his tone never hardened into bitterness. He did not curse the FBI. He did not obsess over informants. He did not portray himself as a victim of injustice. Instead, he spoke like a man reviewing a completed experiment. Some parts failed, some succeeded. The results were mixed. Lessons were learned. That detachment is chilling, because it suggests that for Bonanno, human cost was secondary to structural insight. Lives were variables. Loyalty was a mechanism. Betrayal was a malfunction. Everything was processed intellectually, rarely emotionally. This is why some psychologists who have studied his writings describe him not as impulsive or sadistic, but as profoundly compartmentalized. Bonanno did not deny violence. He quarantined it. He placed it behind walls of language, ritual, and justification until it no longer disrupted his self-image. In other words, he normalized it. And normalization is the most dangerous form of cruelty. It does not scream. It does not shock. It integrates. It becomes routine. It becomes policy. Joe Bonanno did not need to enjoy violence to wield it effectively. He only needed to accept it as necessary. And necessity, once established, silences doubt. This is perhaps the most important lesson hidden inside his story. Evil does not always announce itself as evil. Sometimes it arrives dressed as order. as tradition, as responsibility, as the burden of leadership. Joe Bonanno believed he was carrying a weight others could not. That belief insulated him from remorse and justified his authority. It also isolated him. Because once you see yourself as indispensable, every disagreement becomes betrayal, and every challenge becomes existential. That mindset led directly to his failed power play against rival bosses. Bonanno did not miscalculate tactics. He misjudged the moment. The world had already moved on from the kind of centralized authority he envisioned. The mafia no longer wanted philosophers. It wanted managers, opportunists, survivors who could navigate a hyper-pragmatic landscape. Bonanno's tragedy is not that he lost power, it's that he lost relevance. And relevance, to a man like Bonanno, mattered more than dominance. This is why his post-mafia life feels so deliberate. He did not spiral, he did not self-destruct. He pivoted from boss to observer, from enforcer to interpreter, from silence to selective disclosure. In doing so, he created a second career, one far less dangerous, but arguably more influential. Because through his words, Joe Bonanno reached audiences he never could have controlled through fear. Students, intellectuals, filmmakers, the curious public. He entered spaces where guns were useless and ideas ruled, and he did so on his own terms. That alone makes him unique in the annals of organized crime. But uniqueness does not equal absolution. The men who died under his command did not get to write memoirs. The families impacted by his decisions did not get to curate their legacy. History, as Bonanno understood it, favors those who survive long enough to speak. And he survived. Not because he was the most brutal, not because he was the most beloved, but because he understood restraint, when to act, when to wait, and when to disappear. Joe Bonanno's life is a study in controlled exposure. He revealed just enough to remain relevant, just enough to seem transparent, just enough to shape debate, while never surrendering the core. That core remains sealed. And perhaps that is the final, enduring mystery. Not who Joe Bonanno was, but who he chose not to be, on record. Because somewhere beneath the philosophy, beneath the calm, beneath the carefully measured words, there is a version of Joe Bonanno that history will never meet. A version that acted without explanation, decided without justification, ordered without reflection. That man died with him. The rest he left behind, polished, composed, and forever incomplete. And as long as his story continues to provoke debate rather than certainty, Joe Bonanno's final strategy remains intact. He is not judged, he is discussed. And in the world he came from, that is the closest thing to immortality. And being discussed, rather than judged, was never an accident. It was the endpoint of a lifetime spent mastering control without spectacle. Joe Bonanno understood something most men in power never do. Authority does not need to announce itself. The loudest figure in the room is rarely the one deciding the outcome. Bonanno cultivated invisibility long before invisibility became a survival strategy. When others expanded through aggression, he expanded through patience. When others inspired fear, he inspired inevitability. This is why his name does not carry the same visceral reaction as some of his contemporaries. There are no iconic crime scenes permanently attached to him in the public imagination, no single image of carnage that defines his reign. Instead, there is a blur of meetings, alliances, quiet decisions made behind closed doors. His violence was procedural, not theatrical, and procedure leaves fewer emotional fingerprints. Yet the absence of spectacle does not mean the absence of guilt. It means the guilt is harder to locate. Bonanno's world functioned on delayed consequences. Orders passed through layers. Responsibility diffused. By the time violence occurred, it appeared almost autonomous, an outcome of the system rather than a choice by an individual. This diffusion was not accidental. It was engineered. And Bonanno was exceptionally skilled at it. This is one reason he remained insulated from prosecution for so long. Another is more unsettling. There were fewer people willing to speak against him with conviction, not because they loved him, but because he had not humiliated them. He did not rule through constant degradation. He ruled through structure. And structure creates compliance without trauma loud enough to demand revenge. When the mafia eventually began to unravel, it was not men like Bonanno who triggered the collapse. It was the more modern bosses, those who demanded absolute loyalty while offering none, those who flaunted wealth and violence, those who made themselves impossible to ignore. Bonanno had already stepped back by the time the house began to burn. Once again, timing protected him. Even now, when former associates speak about Joe Bonanno, their tone is often restrained. They do not praise him, but they do not curse him either. He is spoken of like an old institution, something formidable, outdated, and strangely impersonal. That tone alone tells you how effectively he dehumanized his own authority. And that is perhaps his darkest achievement. Because to strip leadership of emotion is to strip it of empathy. Decisions become clean, consequences become abstract. Suffering becomes collateral. Joe Bonanno was not cruel in the theatrical sense, but cruelty does not require passion. It only requires indifference to outcomes beyond the objective. He had that indifference mastered. This is why attempts to romanticize him always fall apart under scrutiny. The more closely you listen to his words, the clearer it becomes that his moral universe had rigid boundaries and little room for the lives caught outside them. Honor existed, but it was selective. Loyalty was sacred but conditional. Family mattered, but hierarchy mattered more. In that hierarchy, Bonanno always placed himself near the top, not as a tyrant, but as a necessary constant. He believed systems needed guardians. He believed chaos was worse than injustice. He believed some men were born to decide and others to obey. These beliefs do not sound monstrous at first glance. They sound organized, rational, even responsible. That is what makes them dangerous. Joe Bonanno was not a product of madness. He was a product of coherence taken too far. And coherence, when untethered from accountability, becomes authoritarianism in its most stable form. By the time Bonanno reached old age, the world he helped build no longer needed him and could no longer touch him. The institutions that replaced the mafia were stronger, louder, and more intrusive. Surveillance replaced secrecy. Paper trails replaced loyalty. The new order did not care about honor. Bonanno observed this with what can only be described as anthropological interest. He had become a relic, watching the rise of a system even more impersonal than his own, and perhaps that realization offered him a final bitter comfort, that his world, for all its brutality, at least acknowledged the human element, even if only for control. The new world did not. It processed people as data, as cases, as assets. Bonanno had lived long enough to see power lose its face entirely, so he wrote. Not to confess, not to repent, but to be remembered on his own terms. And here is the final irony, the one that lingers long after the last page is turned. Joe Bonanno did not need forgiveness. He did not need validation. He did not even need belief. He only needed engagement. As long as his story invites analysis, debate rather than dismissal, he remains active. His influence persists not through commands, but through questions. And questions, unlike orders, do not expire. Who was he, really? A guardian of tradition? A failed autocrat? A disciplined survivor? A master manipulator? A man shaped by circumstance? Or a man who shaped circumstance and then denied it? The answer shifts depending on who is asking. And that instability is his final triumph. Joe Bonanno did not leave behind a verdict. He left behind a puzzle. And puzzles, by their nature, refuse to die. And a puzzle, once released into the world, no longer belongs to its creator. It evolves. It absorbs the fears, values, and obsessions of each new generation that examines it. Joe Bonanno understood this instinctively. He knew that certainty kills curiosity, but ambiguity feeds it endlessly. That is why his story still feels unfinished. Even now, decades after his death, new interpretations surface. Not because new facts emerge, but because the world keeps changing around the same facts. In eras of instability, Bonanno is revisited as a symbol of order. In eras obsessed with transparency, he is scrutinized as a master of concealment. In times of cynicism, he is framed as a manipulator. In times of nostalgia, as a relic of a darker but more honest age. None of these readings are complete. All of them say as much about us as they do about him. This is the final layer of Joe Bonanno's endurance, adaptability after death. Most criminals are frozen in time, defined by a single act, a single image, a single downfall. Bonanno avoided that trap. His life offers no clean climax, no definitive moral lesson. Instead, it stretches slowly, deliberately, across decades, ideologies, and interpretations. It behaves less like a biography and more like a mirror. And mirrors are unsettling, because when we examine Joe Bonanno closely, we are forced to confront uncomfortable questions about power itself, about how often violence hides behind structure, about how easily order can masquerade as virtue, about how survival is sometimes mistaken for wisdom. Bonanno never claimed to be a saint, but he did claim coherence. He offered a worldview where everything had its place, its logic, its justification. That worldview is seductive precisely because it eliminates randomness. It tells us that suffering is not arbitrary, it is functional. History shows us again and again how dangerous that idea can be. Joe Bonanno did not invent it. He inherited it, refined it, and executed it with discipline. That discipline earned him longevity, but it also ensured that the damage he caused would be diffuse, indirect, and therefore harder to reckon with. Diffuse harm rarely demands closure. It lingers, and so does his presence. Long after the mafia lost its grip on America, long after the neighborhoods changed and the old names faded from storefronts, Joe Bonanno remains oddly contemporary. Not because of what he did, but because of how he framed it. His language fits comfortably into modern discussions about systems, power structures, loyalty networks, and institutional morality. Strip away the mob context, and much of what he said could apply to corporations, governments, even digital empires. That is a deeply troubling thought, because it suggests that Joe Bonanno was not merely a criminal of his time, but an early student of power in its most abstract form. He understood that the mechanics of control do not require guns, they require belief, narrative, internalized rules. A sense that resistance is futile not because it is punished, but because it is unthinkable. This is why Bonanno's calm is so disturbing. It is the calm of someone who believes the system is larger than any individual, and that he, at one point, was its steward. Stewards rarely apologize. They preserve, and preservation, when applied to flawed systems, becomes complicity. Yet still, the story refuses to resolve into a single judgment. Because Joe Bonanno also represents something vanishing, restraint in an age of excess, silence in an age of exposure, patience in an age of immediacy. Even his critics concede this. He was not impulsive, he was not sloppy, he did not confuse attention with power. That alone separates him from the chaos that followed. So where does that leave us? With a man who cannot be simplified, with a legacy that cannot be closed, with a figure who survives not because he was right, but because he was careful. Joe Bonanno did not ask history to love him, he asked it to keep talking. And it has. Because every time someone revisits his life, they are forced to slow down, to listen, to weigh context against consequence, to sit with contradiction rather than escape it. That discomfort is his final footprint. Not blood, not fear, not domination, but unease. The quiet, persistent unease that comes from realizing that some of the most dangerous men are not those who shout, but those who explain. And Joe Bonanno explained himself better than almost anyone who ever lived in the shadows. That is why, even now, his story does not end. It simply pauses, waiting for the next interpretation. And here, finally, the story closes, not with a verdict, not with redemption, but with clarity of intent. Joe Bonanno did not live to be understood in the way ordinary men hope to be understood. He lived to be interpreted. He built a life designed to survive scrutiny, contradiction, and time itself. When power slipped from his hands, he did not rage against the loss. He adapted the battlefield. He shifted from control of men to control of meaning. That was his last transformation. In the end, Joe Bonanno leaves us with no catharsis, no final confession, no dramatic collapse that reassures us the system corrected itself. What he leaves behind is far more unsettling. A life that functioned efficiently, quietly, and coherently until it no longer could, and a man who accepted that moment without illusion. He understood that history does not punish everyone. It categorizes, it debates, it revisits. And in that space, between condemnation and curiosity, he secured his place. Joe Bonanno was not the loudest gangster, not the bloodiest, not the most feared. He was something far rarer. He was a strategist of time, a curator of silence, a man who realized that power fades, but narrative adapts. Others died young and became warnings. Others lived loudly and became evidence. Joe Bonanno lived long and became a question. And questions are immortal, because every era that rediscovers him must wrestle with the same unease. How much damage can be done calmly? How much violence can hide behind structure? How many lives can be altered without spectacle? And how easily can order be mistaken for virtue? There is no final answer, only the echo of a composed voice reminding us that systems do not collapse when exposed. They collapse when no one believes in them anymore. Joe Bonanno believed, until he didn't. And when belief failed, he documented it. Not to warn, not to confess, but to endure. So his story ends exactly where he wanted it to end. Not in darkness, not in absolution, but in discussion. Because as long as his name provokes thought rather than certainty, as long as his legacy resists a clean moral conclusion, as long as his calm still unsettles, Joe Bonanno remains what he always was: unresolved, unfinished, and impossible to ignore.